Welcome, everyone who is joining from the recording. We had our introductions and then talked about some of the outreach events, and now on to some of the more technical issues. So the first semi-technical issue is issue 145 that was raised last year, about almost exactly a year ago, by Conal, who at the time was at the National Museum of Australia. That we have a bunch of sexist language that we are endorsing, essentially, through use, such as man-made object. And can't we instead call that something like artifact rather than man-made object, or at least find some gender-neutral term for these sorts of things, which is an important topic, and I think one that if we can discuss today will be valuable, because the earlier we make big changes, if we were to change man-made object to say artifact, then the easier it is for everyone, because there's fewer lines of code or that need to be changed and fewer lines of documentation that need to be updated. So I did raise this with the SIG and in the third comment down there, and it did have one response from Thanasis, which, removing man is a reasonable idea, but that was essentially it. There was no real significant engagement with the issue at the time. So, to Margaret's point in the issue, why do we use CRM at all? We could just use something else. That is sort of one of the fundamental decisions that isn't really up for discussion at this point. CRM is the museum standard for ontologies, and if we were to roll our own, we would just be competing with CRM constantly, and something like this is not a reason to compete, especially because we can change the JSON form via the JSON LD context without changing the ontology directly, by introducing, instead of man-made object as mapping to CRM E22 man-made object, introducing instead artifact or object or anything else, human-created object. So, yes, and as Pat says, it's not just this one use of man. There are other, there is man-made feature and so on. So,
may I jump in?
Please.
Sorry, I wasn't here earlier. I just got in late, but I'm George. I'm from ICS Fourth, and I'm in the CRM SIG. So, I mean, I would support. I mean, I don't see there's any. I could controversially say I don't know if it's sexist language, but I don't see any reason to not find a better formulation that's better to be more representative. So an artifact seems pretty good. If you go for artifacts, maybe you should include physical though, because an artifact could also, like, concepts or artifacts. There's also, I mean, a label is just a label, but so when you're not boxed in with the artifact thing later on, maybe. But I mean, I think artifact sounds pretty good. It definitely gives the idea that humans have made this thing. Physical also helps grab the fact that it's material.
Mm-hmm. So then, yeah, well, and I agree that a label is just a label, but at the same time, names have power, or language has power. So yeah, I'm also supportive of this one.
How worried are we about the fact that this will, everywhere else that people use CDOC CRM, this is the terminology and framing that they use, and that trying to map our concepts back to concepts documented and expressed anywhere else in the CRM world, this is a pretty big change and makes understanding this much harder.
For CRM people, you mean, in terms of the understanding? If you're coming from a CRM background?
Anyone who's come from a linked data background, anyone who's engaged with the CDOC CRM, anyone who's read any of the many articles or publications that reference it, I worry that this increasingly bifurcates the audience of people who use linked art and people who use the CRM but not linked art.
Yeah, I disagree, I have to say, for two reasons. One, we've already done this because, such as part. So in the CRM, there is 5 or 6 different ways of saying such and some class has a part of the class. So we have rationalized that in the ontology to say that there is two JSON level terms, part and part of, and they contextually map to the appropriate P108 composed of, and P whatever it is, 46 or something. I forget what the physical partitioning property is. So we've already gone down this route. We have to do it for some things such as classified as P2 has type, because there is already type. So making further improvements such that the audience of this particular data finds it easier to work with, and in this case, less politically sensitive, I think is a value add and not an impediment.
The other area that I've seen confusion arising, particularly, for instance, with the part work, is if we ever intend for this to be interpreted as linked data using tools such as Sparkle, which is when we are using it here at the Getty, we are using it both as the JSON schema and as Sparkle. It becomes increasingly difficult to map between what you're seeing in your JSON and what you're getting out of the Sparkle. It becomes very difficult to try to map between those because the language is so different.
Yep.
It can be done. It's just
not really a use case. Yeah, we've in the scope for at least this work, so long as it maps into CRM, so you can transform it back and forth. The fact that we have a context that is not identical to the ontology is completely intentional.
fair enough. I'm just pointing out that it is adding difficulty to the implementation work that I'm trying to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, understood.
And just a minor point as well, that I think the SIG didn't pick up on it, but not because we don't care. We just got involved in other issues. I don't think there's any strong objection to the possibility of changing it. And certainly not on the basis of we really want it, say, man-made or something like that. It's more the complexities of making the change to the label and then publishing that. I mean, was a change in a collection to curated holding, which is still an ongoing complication for many people. So, but in fact, it's just 3 classes that would have to have a more, a more updated label. So that, potentially could, be an evolution that's going to be in the cards in the future.
Yeah.
I think all we need really is Rob to send a proposal for voting, really. Then once it's voted, it's going to be discussed. We have to discuss it.
Yeah. So the three are man-made object, man-made feature, and what's the last one?
It's man-made thing.
Oh, man-made thing.
The grouping class.
Yeah. So for folks who are not deeply involved in the ontology layer, what is the most intuitive term for an object that happens to be created by some person? Is artifact reasonable, or is there something better that we can suggest? Because if we come with a proposal rather than just a problem, it's much more likely to be successful. And if that solution also happens to be how curators and non-ontologists think about these things, then it's much more likely to be adopted more broadly. So,
sorry, before that, may I interject as an ontologist?
Please.
Comment, because we've had these discussions in the making of the European data model ages ago, and that would push me, so again, as an ontologist, to support the solution to just delete man, because going for artifacts or adding things like physical, I mean, we've seen actually, so maybe I'm not so much an ontologist here, we've seen practitioners wondering what would be covered by artifact and what would be physical, whether when they have born digital stuff or even conceptual work that they may want to represent. So after several months of really deep pain, we ended up with something that tried to avoid that. And perhaps just removing man from these things would be easier. And it would also simplify the moving from one version to the
other. Yeah, I missed a little bit of what you said, Antoine. Did other people hear everything okay?
No, I got some garbling myself. Yeah.
Sorry, I can try again.
That was clearer.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I've moved my mic. Yeah, so as an ontologist, but also having dealt with practitioners in the making of the European data model, and that also involves some people involved inside of CRM. We've tried to have things like artifact or physical object, and that proved to be difficult in front of people who were wondering whether their stuff would qualify as artifacts. Sometimes they had born digital things, sometimes conceptual works. And eventually we opted for a solution that sort of avoided these really complex ontological debates. So that's why I would tend to support the option of systematically and simply deleting man from the names of this class. And I also think it would make migration easier, and it would tackle some of David's concerns a bit simpler, in a simpler way, I think.
Yep. Yeah, so if there was a single solution that replaced man in man-made object, man-made feature, and man-made thing, as opposed to having artifact, which is very different from man-made object, and then still requiring then different specs for man-made thing and man-made feature, that would be to David's point and to yours, that would be an easier path forwards. So, but when you said by simply deleting man, was that replace man with something else, or was it just indeed delete it and have it made object, made feature, made thing?
Yeah, the latter.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
What do people think about that as a?
I like it a great deal, and as I've just commented in the comments, the text comments, to me, if you have if you're calling something a made object, it is completely reasonable to infer that it was made purposefully, and it's then reasonable to infer that it is in fact artificial, which is our point, which is exactly what we're trying to say. So I feel like just the phrase made object or made whatever carries, it's admittedly a little bit odd in English, or it sounds a little odd in English, but I think it does carry the meaning that we want and nothing else, which is always a good thing.
Any other thoughts on this? Should we support or objections?
What about human-made object?
Yeah, it's possible. my intuition personally is that made object sounds slightly more natural than human made, because in fact in CRM only humans can carry out productions. So if it is made by something, then it is made by a human. In that robots do not produce art.
Yeah, that's my point. Is that again, it is a kind of an odd locution, but if you have something that is made, you can infer that it was purposefully made. Like it you know, that's the point that we're trying to get across, and that seems to me to be enough language to do it. And I don't have a problem with human made. It's just a little bit longer. And yeah.
So for describing a piece of meteorite or something, there are other properties in right modeling for it, right? Like here in the National Museum of Brazil, there was this huge meteorite that was not burned in the fire, and I would mind what the right way of describing it. Mm-hmm. But I'm not acquainted enough to CRM, so there might be another way of describing it.
Yeah. So for natural objects that have been imbued with some cultural value, there's a couple of different ways that it can be thought of. That either the making is the imbuing with a value for the object, and that hence you, for example, if it's a natural history museum and you have dinosaur bones, then the production of it is not the birth of the dinosaur millions of years ago. It's when it's dug up by someone out of the ground, or when it's otherwise not just part of the landscape. Or there are higher level classes such as physical thing, which can be used to describe objects that are not artificial in any way. Those are sort of, we've intentionally left that level of description out of scope for now, just to avoid the complexity and focus on the art part of Linked Art. So yes, it is a very good question, and I think we'll come back to it. But yeah, for this iteration, the focus is on the man-made, the artificial. I was looking at the words man-made. The artificial, the human-created objects, as opposed to the naturally occurring ones.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So
I think.
So yep,
I think also, yeah, the made object will probably be easily digested in the SIG as well, if we were to suggest alteration to the label.
Mm-hmm. And George, your opinion on that?
I mean,
you know Martin perhaps better than anyone.
I think, well, I mean, I have no idea how Martin would vote, but he certainly would have a problem with attributing agency to robots. But artificial, I mean, artificial almost sounds like the most neutral. I mean, I don't want to make like a stand now, but the adjective artificial also sounds quite good. It's true. There's an inherent. I mean, I'm looking at Margaret's comments here. I mean, there's a position in CRM that is anthropocentric for sure, and that's because of scope. So I mean, it's looking at cultural history and buying a lot of traditional Western philosophy by default. So yeah, agreed. Animals could make things probably. Artificial could be a good adjective. Artificial thing, or artificial object, artificial feature, and then we could all argue, and then afterwards one could look at the implications of expanding the scope of intentionality to other creatures.
I would argue against artificial. It connotes falsity, and that an artificial object is not a real object, or is. And I don't think it adds any clarity. So my example is a bird's nest, which might be incorporated into some driftwood sculpture or something. And it's certainly made. It's made with intentionality, arguably, about half of the birds. But it's not human-made. But is it artificial? I don't know whether it's artificial or not. I don't think it adds any clarity.
Yeah, for the bird's nest, it isn't a man-made object in the current, using the current label, because it wasn't created by a person. Yeah. So, and this is one of a frequent objection made to the SIG, by myself included.
That example would suggest that human-made is preferable to just simply made.
Yeah, I mean, it's about scope. So I mean, CRM is not pretending to model the entire world, but to model cultural history. And so there's an argument that maybe animals have cultural history, but that's a bigger argument than the scope of links of describing artwork. So, I mean, unless you get into a very obscure collection.
Yeah. So how about
human-made sounds unnatural, but labels are just labels. So maybe it would sound natural if we agree to it.
Yes, we are used to saying, well, CRM folks are used to saying man-made object. So how about if we propose to the list 3 options: human-made object, made object, and artificial object, and the same for feature and thing. And we, Linked Art, accept whichever one is acceptable to the SIG. And if we have a preference, maybe in the issue over the next day or two before I send the message to the SIG, if you put in your preference into the issue, I can then sort of include that information in the proposal to the SIG, and we'll see where it goes from there. Then if the SIG eventually says, no, we're sticking with man-made, which given the discussion, I think is not going to be the case, then we also can do the context route to change it in our for our audience, as opposed to at the ontological level. And yeah, we'll certainly, I will do my best to make sure that it gets discussed in June, which is the next SIG meeting, and hopefully on the list before that, so we can get a steer from the SIG as to how people are thinking. What do we think about that as process? Yes.
Yeah, I think if you propose more than one alternatives, the chances are that on the mailing list it might be a bit difficult to decide. So it will have to be June as a decision to be taken at the meeting, I think.
I mean, you can propose it for put it onto the list as a discussion and see if we can solve it email-wise. And if we can't, then it'll push to June. But I mean,
yep.
If we can, unless somebody puts a veto in and says, oh, it's too important, then it's possible we can just get it done by email. That would be ideal if possible. If somebody vetoes, then we have to wait until the next meeting. But
well, as a straw poll for people on the call, into the chat, could you type one of made, artificial, or human-made as to the one that you prefer? And if everyone, maybe by one person, thinks one way or the other, then we can maybe propose that one. But it's not unanimous. So there's not much support. There's not much support for artificial. So how about we propose made and human-made, and we'll see which of those two the SIG likes, because it's now pretty evenly split between made and human-made. And I think, well, would anyone who suggested made be fundamentally opposed to human-made, or vice versa? If you proposed human-made, would you be fundamentally opposed to made?
And not fundamentally, it's just much longer.
Yeah.
Well, I won't nitpick very long, but there's much more made than human.
Yeah, which, yeah, can be a positive or a negative given the scope. All right, so it is pretty much split down the middle. I will propose both, and we will see which one the SIG prefers. That discussion
it's not really even. There are twice as more made than human made.
Twice as. Oh, as in there's a lot of made objects that are not human made.
No, I mean in our votes in the chat.
Oh. I did not count.
I think it is that human made is only 2 characters longer than man made, but made object is significantly shorter than either.
Yeah. Human, yeah. I will propose both, and we will see what happens. Well, we did not get onto parts or colors, so we'll keep them for next time. And yeah, I will also, well, George, Nessus, or I will report back on the human or made discussion. Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to Richard for taking such excellent notes. And we'll talk again in a couple of weeks. So, thanks.
Thanks.
And bye.
Everyone.
Bye.